Alfredo Brown is a fantasy football analyst for Footballguys and co-hosts the Footballguys Fantasy Football Show. He's a former football scout and recruitment assistant at Florida International University. He loves going on long walks with his dogs, and he's got a fantastic head of hair. These are his late round perspectives.
My gosh, is this the cold open?
I have cold opens.
I know. I'm a huge fan. I'm a big fan of cold opens.
I didn't know exactly how I wanted to start these shows, but I'm a big fan of the podcast Armchair Expert. You ever listen to Armchair Expert with Dak Shepard?
Yeah, and I also listen to Smartless that they do kind of a similar thing as well. Yeah,
Smartless is great. Smartless is also great. Those are my going on a walk shows. I saw you went on a great walk today with some dogs.
That's becoming my daily ritual. I throw on a funny podcast like that, walk with the dogs. It's a great way to start the morning.
It is. It's great. And you can get a lot of different perspectives, if you will. But I like to, the fantasy space, it feels like there's a lot of sort of the same format and layout of podcasts and stuff like that, which is sort of why I did what I did with the late round podcast with just, the 15 to 20 minute bite-sized shows, because I wanted something a little bit different in the first place. But with perspectives, I just didn't want it to be I wanted some sort of format that was a little bit different. And the cold open, it feels like the cold open didn't exist as much in the fantasy space as it probably should.
I've tried to test that a little bit, but I'm not the one that gets to upload the audio for our show. So every time I'm like, oh yeah, we did a cold open, let's test it out. And then Dave's like, nah. That wasn't good, but I love it because you're kind of joining the people you want to listen to mid conversation.
That's right.
But it's not how it would be awkwardly in real life if you walked up in the middle of a conversation, just stood there. It's exactly. It's fun.
Exactly. Armchair Expert has gotten colder and colder as the series has gone. I mean, it's 6 years I think that they've done the show now. But when they first started, it was very much buttoned up. We're going to intro, welcome this guest and then, getting into it or whatever. But now it's them, getting coffee together in the background and making sure that having these very faint conversations into the microphone before they actually sit down in their chairs to have the conversation for the podcast. I like that though. Like you said, you invite people into the conversation more. You let them realize that when I'm talking to people like yourself, we're friends, we've known each other now for a decent amount of time. We've now met each other IRL thanks to the expo. And so it's not this super intimidating environment for people to walk into, where I do feel with the late round podcast, I'm not going to lie, with it being as intense as it can be sometimes with just the boom, 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 boom nature of it, I wanted sort of the opposite vibe with that.
Yeah, I mean, I've loved them. I've been listening to them.
Thank you.
As they go along. You're okay. The guests are great, though. I'll be honest.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. You're 100% correct. And you, my friend, I'm very excited to talk to. I don't know if people fully recognize and realize sort of your background and where you sort of came from when it comes to football, and your analysis and where it sort of stems from. So you went to Florida International. Do people down there just say FIU? That's just there's no Florida That's just too many words to say, too many syllables to say.
Yeah, and 90% of the population from down here ends up going to FIU anyways. Right. So that's just it. It's basically the only public university down here, because you end up with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. So it's mostly just out of school show up there.
Right. So you went to FIU. You were a football scout and you were a recruitment assistant at FIU. What kind of work did that sort of entail? Is that sort of the foundation of football for you? How did you get into that? Did you play back in the day? What's that whole story like?
So how I got into it, I played high school. I was okay. Not anything, I wasn't getting offers or anything like that. I mean, who knew short, slow guys that had medial skill can't play at the next level? But I knew I loved the game and I loved watching it. And I kind of fell into one of those who can't teach. And I really kind of loved that. And the more I kept watching and studying, I got really obsessed with the draft. I was always obsessed with the draft as a kid. And I just started to learn what makes a good football player. Even if I can't do it, what makes it? And I was living on campus. I was right next to the stadium. I was a sports management major at FIU. We needed to get some internship credit, and everyone else was kind of doing things of I'm going to go work for a team in marketing or business or this or that. And I was like, you know what? Let's shoot my shot. And I sent an email over to the director of player personnel over at FIU. He surprisingly responded, brought me in for an interview. It was the most informal 3-question interview ever. It was basically like, what's your major? All right, you need internship credit? Cool. What's your schedule like? All right, yeah, come on in. And I started the next day. I got hired as an intern, and it was all the boring stuff like printing sheets out for meetings and setting up cones and organizing files and stuff like that. I think the 2 funniest things I did to start out was I was Mario Cristobal's like sandwich boy when he was coach there. So I'd like run to Publix across the street, bring him his sandwich, and he'd see me. He'd be like, "My guy." Never learned my name, but he was just like, "My guy."
Right.
Man, thanks. And the other thing, which I got known for, which I really hated, which my job was to get on the golf cart and go around campus and make sure that players were actually in class. And so they'd give me a checklist and be like, all right, T.Y. Hilton's supposed to be in chem right now, so go and check and make sure that he's there. And I'd be like, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. I hated it so much. Eventually, though, like I told my boss there, I was like, hey, I want to be able to do a little bit more. They gave me a pack of like a bunch of players to evaluate. And they're, he's like, you can actually do this pretty well. So that grew into me like doing a few more things around the office. I did like freshman orientation stuff. So I was able to handle campus tours for players. That became a really natural thing for me to do. I knew the area because I grew up in it and I played football in the area. So I could easily go to games nearby, request film from coaches, things like that. And that turned into, okay, you understand our style, start writing up reports, give them to the coordinators, the position coaches, things like that. So it was really cool. It was a cool experience. The thing that I learned real quickly, though, is that I did not want to be in that field because once the head coach got fired, everyone was gone. And that was it. Even the people that had nothing to do with football operations were gone. It was kind of like a real like reboot. And I said, man, I don't want that to be a career for me where my job is based on one guy and everyone else gets let go. Like I want to do something where if I'm good at it, I can actually be rewarded for that. So I just knew I wanted to go a different way. Yeah,
it makes total sense. So would you say that your like foundation for prospecting then was sort of developed with that gig? And is that, I mean, obviously your process is going to evolve through the years and all that. And you're not now with what you're doing, you're focusing more on fantasy football and how things might translate that way too, to some degree. So, how is your, or what is your process for prospecting? What does that look like? Obviously I'm someone who approaches things in a very numbers driven way. But I think that I say this on like every late round perspectives, but I don't like really necessarily bucketing those two groups, saying that you're a film guy or you're a numbers driven guy because the two can be married very easily. But how do you go about your prospecting work?
So it's definitely changed a lot over the years. To kind of give you an idea of what it's like when you're doing it for college, you're looking at high school kids that really don't have a lot of refinement. You're just kind of seeing like, okay, are the raw elements there? Is this an athletic kid that can grow and can we coach it and this and that? And that's changed a lot for me over the years. So one of the things that people are surprised when I tell them is I actually don't watch college football. Like I can't. For how much we do on Sundays and then the rest throughout the week, if I don't take Saturdays off, I'm going to get divorced. And I will be single real quick, man. So I know that before I was actually getting films and stuff, a lot of what happens is, when I'm scouting at FIU, you're getting highlight reels from kids and coaches where they're cutting it off halfway through and you're trying to determine like, oh, did that kid get caught from behind? Like, does he actually have that speed? And so you kind of went from this really, I don't want to say barbaric, but a really low level of kind of scouting to now it's like, oh, okay, we've got all 22. We've got some good angles on this, which is just, it's so much better. And every year I've tried to just improve my process a little bit. Before it was fill out this scorecard based on position. Each position has different categories that we're looking for. Fill this out on a 1 to 10, drop a couple notes on each of them, and that was it. And then you pass it along to the next guy. And you kind of had to learn how to write the language so that everyone understood it. Now I'm doing a lot more of the full page write-ups. Let's get some player comps. People love player comps. Let's do the projected draft capital, things like that. And as I watch film, I throw on the L22 and I just kind of word vomit onto the Google Doc that I have. And as I see something, I'll write it. If I notice a trend, I'll go back and keep adding to that note, reinforce it with more context. And then now what I've really started to do, and is a lot of this, is thanks to you and thanks to so many smart people in the industry, is you can't have one half without the other. I have to go back and reinforce my film analysis with some stats, with some data, and I'll go and I'll check, the premium PFF stats, stuff like that. And if I wrote something on a running back and it makes guys miss an open field, well, let's go check the data. And if it just because I see it a few times in the 3 games I watch, like, does he really do that often? Does he, how many missed tackles forced does he have? What's the yards after contact per attempt like? Things like that. And, those kind of stats weren't around for me over 10 years ago when I was doing stuff like that. And so I try to go back and say, like, okay, do these numbers match with what I'm seeing on film? If they do, awesome, I was right. If they don't, let's just ignore those numbers because they don't matter anyways. I'm always going to be right. And you kind of you want to see how much you can marry the data to the film, and that's been really cool to start doing.
Yeah, it's really interesting you bring up the high school to college transition versus the college to pro transition. Obviously, I just haven't really sat down and thought about it that much in terms of like what scouts in college are doing versus what scouts in the pros are doing. Number one, you talk about the level of film that you're getting in terms of just like the technology itself, right? It just kind of sucks whenever you're talking about guys who are just like chopping up their own film and putting together their tape themselves. But then on top of that, what you're looking for from high school to college, I would assume you're just saying, can this guy blow past defenders and is he physically built like a monster, right? Like it's more, I would assume that the athletic traits are probably a little bit more important from high school to college than college to pros.
Yeah, that's what a lot of it is. A lot of it is just, can this guy get better? Can we coach him up? Things like that. A lot of things like that you don't really have control over when you're talking about players going from college to the pros and you're trying to project that for fantasy. You don't see that stuff. So it's like you'll look at a high school offense running the wing T and they'll have maybe one wide receiver that catches 2 balls a game and everything else is okay, let's throw 3 or 4 running backs back here. We have multiple fullbacks and it's just like, how do you even try to project this to the next level? You just try to see who's most athletic and, can we coach this up? And that's more or less what it ended up being.
Yeah. I mean, the other nice part about what we do is we can kind of sit back and let the people who are doing strictly scouting from college to pros sort of filter out, like, I mean, there's hundreds of wide receivers, let's say, or draft eligible running backs and such. We can at least let them filter those guys out that I can plug them into my prospect model and have a very condensed data set, or you can go and look at a condensed set of players that's 30, 40 deep at a position or something like that, as opposed to 300 players deep. Because, you, I'm not watching college football the way that some of those other guys are. Whereas if you're scouting in college, these high school guys, you're probably just having to like go everywhere and look far and wide as much as you possibly can. That has to be a little bit frustrating, right? Like, is it not? I love I wait patiently, and this year was a little bit tilting because it came out later, but I wait patiently for the combine invite list to come out because I know that that's how I've sort of defined the class and who I'm working with, and I can work within those parameters, and it's a lot easier to do that. But when you're talking about high school to college, I mean, it's like you're literally are you not just looking at the state of Florida plus, right? Like you're looking at anything and everything, right?
Yeah, and on top of that, you'll have like they'll tell you, okay, man, I really thought it was just as simple as kind of like how you do it on the NCAA video games. Yeah. And then like the more we talk to the coaches, they're like, no, we really only send guys to these states too. And like you're not likely to get guys that are going to come all the way from somewhere else, or we don't have connections with these coaches, things like that. Like there's so much red tape that goes into it, but it's just, and you're getting film submissions from kids that probably wouldn't. I mean, if we can go 0-star prospects, like that happens too, like guys that have no business playing at the next level. So you just get so much. And then like there's times where you'll get a film and like one of the things I got was Jonnu Smith, and he was relatively unknown at the time. And so like to me, this is always the feather in my hat being like, hey guys, I think this kid's pretty good. And I was always kind of like the first filter, and it would go to me and then the next person. And then like that was, you don't typically see a lot of these recruits and the profiles that get written up, the scouting reports make it from one coaching staff to the next, but it did. And he ended up being a guy that was like a big part of that class, a big part of that team. And obviously, I mean, the rest, he goes to the NFL. So that was always pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, who knew that he would end up being in the NFL, taking away all those looks from Kyle Pitts in 2023?
Yeah, now he's a villain. That's his origin story.
Yes, exactly.
Oh my God, it was my fault.
It's your fault. You did this in the fantasy football community. Thanks, Alfredo. Thanks, buddy.
I've never even thought of it that way. I hate myself so much right now.
My gosh. What's something that you learned, like, going through that process of being a scout for them and helping them out? That sort of has translated to fantasy football and your process in fantasy football.
So, I mean, it's the biggest thing. I kind of briefly mentioned it before, but it's just like how much now for fantasy football that we have so little control and so little know-how of what these coaches are going to do, how they're going to develop these guys along. It happens to us all the time. We look at a guy's production profile or the film and say, man, this is a can't miss player. And then they still just don't work out in the NFL. Like, stuff happens. You end up with N'Keal Harry's out there that just wide receiver one and ends up on a team where it's just not right for him. And so that's one of the biggest things for me to notice. And it's not really an actionable point for the listeners, right? But it's something to at least consider a bit more, is that there are so many intangible factors that come into play here. At least in college, and at least for FIU, a small school like that, it was different. It was just find someone who can be molded. It felt a lot like being Rick Moranis in Little Giants, where he's just kind of like walking around to all the kids. He's like, "You like football? No. Yeah. You want to play? No. Great, you're on our team." Like, yeah. That's kind of how it felt. This is very different. This is at the top of the crop, and it's so hard to project how are these guys going to fit into systems. Even now, we look at coordinators returning to the NFL or jumping into the NFL, and their offenses don't always stay the same year after year. We've kind of seen Sean McVay change a little bit every single year too. So it's tough, man. There's so many new factors that go into play, and how are they going to practice? How are they going to do in meetings? Things like, are they going to show up on time to meetings? Like, it's the craziest thing. Kadarius Toney, I think, is one of those guys that became the butt of every single joke this season. Mm-hmm. And he's a guy that I think film people loved. And I think analytics people started to get kind of behind it when they said, man, when he touches the ball, it's electric. Right. And then it was just like, guys, it doesn't matter what we think if it's not happening on the other, this invisible wall that we can't see that is the NFL. So that's been kind of the tough thing. And noticing how quick it has to go. The NFL does not have the patience it used to, where, someone like our guy, Sky Moore, it's probably not going to happen for him. And right. Then guys like Quentin Johnston, Jalen Hyatt, like they're going to really need to produce in their second year if they're going to be fantasy relevant. So that's been kind of the biggest thing, is that you have a lot less control. You know a lot less about these players than you think. And man, is the league getting really impatient.
Yeah, look, I also think it plays into sort of how I try to prospect, at least, and that's by looking at the gray area more than looking at it in such a black and white way, right? Like Jalen Hyatt's a great example. The numbers that I looked at going into my model, at least what the model looks at, like Jalen Hyatt, there were plenty of analysts who I really, really respect. Some of the best in the business, like Dane Brugler, liked Jalen Hyatt, right, last season. The thing, though, was that when you dug into his numbers a little bit more, we all knew this. It's not like it was not known, but like he got a ton of his production in that Biletnikoff winning season through the slot and via the slot. And so the question was, yeah, he has this skill set and there are some positive traits, but how is he going to be used in the NFL? Is this going to translate because of his production out of the slot? Well, he went to a team then that had a pretty locked in slot guy in Wan'Dale Robinson. Jalen Hyatt ends up playing the perimeter for most of the season. And I think that we can look back and say, okay, it's probably a misuse of assets here in the way that they use Jalen Hyatt. And I'm not saying that Hyatt's a buy or anything like that, because who knows how they're going to use him moving forward. But I do think that that's a great example of just like how landing spot and how situation itself, not even off the field stuff. Like, who knows? I mean, I have no idea if Jalen Hyatt's a hard worker or not, but regardless, like how he was used in year one is totally different than the things that we liked about him coming out. And so it's just really, really difficult for us to say, this is a clear hit, this is a clear miss, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'll say this, like even going from what I was doing before, you never had to worry about can a talent translate to this level, because we have full control over that. Like what you said is will that translate? What Jalen Hyatt was doing was not something that he would be asked to do in the NFL. So it's like you really have to live in that gray area. That's why, and I love that, because I mean that's not the first time I've heard you say that. That's why when I hear someone be like, "No, I'm completely out on a guy," or "I'm all in on this guy," it's like, we don't have to do that. There needs to be a gray area if you're going to be a responsible analyst when you're doing this and be giving people something that's, I kind of being redundant here, but I try not to be irresponsible with my analysis. And I think that's kind of why you have to live in that gray area.
Yeah, look, I think that the best analysts in any space, not just fantasy football space and what we are, so attached to, any space, anyone that's trying to be an expert in what they're doing, when you hear them say words like probably and likely, those are good words for these people to be using because they know they don't have all the answers. And it's important to know that you don't have all the answers while you're doing this. You're just trying to guide into a higher probability chance of being right with some of this stuff. The NFL Combine's happening. I guess it's already started. So, we're recording this on Thursday. It goes out on Friday. By the time Saturday hits and people are listening to this, they're going to know the 40 times of some of these running backs and wide receivers in this class. Do you care about what goes on at the Combine, at least from, more of a fantasy football perspective?
This is kind of a short answer, and it's one of those gray area answers as well. A little bit, but not a ton. It's similar to like using the data to double check my work. Right. If I was writing over and over, this guy looks slow, and then he goes out and runs a 4.6 as a wide receiver, I'm like, yeah, he was probably just slow. I was right. But, if someone goes out there and I'm just kept right, he's slow. And then he goes out and runs a 4.4, I'm saying, okay, well, what changed, right? Like, did he drop a bunch of weight? Has he been working specifically on this drill? Did his other drills look bad, right? Like, did he have a bad shuttle, And so you kind of go back and you watch the tape and maybe you say like, oh no, it's just the cornerbacks he kept going up against also were running 4.3, 4.4. So like, there's those little things like that where you go back and double check it. I think that the people who totally throw away the Combine, you're not doing it right. Like if it didn't matter, I know obviously it's a great event for the NFL, but if it didn't matter, we wouldn't have all these coaches and GMs there that are actually, caring about this. For me, I want to get the confirmation of measurements. Like measurements, is that something that I experienced so much with the high school and college level? Is that like my own high school coach listed me at 6 foot 220, and like you've met me in person. I am not that, and so but it's like you often find that too with college measurements. So I want to know that the measurements are right. Did we get a good report on medicals, right? Like I know there's a couple players that we've been sort of hearing rumors on already that the medicals are good or bad. Those are big things that come out of this. We don't always hear it, but it's good. But and then like kind of the last thing too is good athletic testing will probably lead to higher draft capital. That's not always a good indicator of success. Right. I mean, that's you get guys like Jonathan Mingo and Tyquan Thornton and all these guys that get gassed up because of a good 40 or whatever it is. But I, to an extent, it matters, and we should be paying attention.
Yeah, I think the last point is very, very important with the fact that, look, we might look at correlation, and I can talk about what goes into my model and say that wide receiver 40 time or any wide receiver athletic testing is not in the model whatsoever. I don't care from that perspective, how a guy runs a 40, but at the same time, there's been studies. There was one that was out this week. You guys can check my Twitter feed and look at a recent retweet that I'd sent out. But there was a study this week even that talked about how NFL teams seem to overrate the 40, and there's like actual data showing how much they overrate the 40 versus how much the 40 actually matters at every position. But like weight adjusted 40 at running back, it's a little bit of signal, especially if you find a guy who's very, very, very slow within speed score. It matters a lot at tight end, position where athleticism just matters a lot. But at wide receiver, it might not matter when it comes to the model, but it will likely boost a guy's draft capital, and draft capital is an input to the model. So I don't want to sit here and say for sure athleticism and the way these guys test means absolutely zero. What I can say is it means zero when you're also dealing with draft capital, right? I'm also interested, you mentioned the measurement stuff. Like we can't understate that side of things either. When you're going through each of these collegiate programs, these guys, most of the time, especially like the bigger schools like an LSU or an Alabama or something like that, they're relatively close with the way that they get their height weight, right? But when you get to some of these smaller schools, I plug them in pre-combine to see generally how big these guys are, right? And there are some guys where it's like 15, 20 pounds off by the time they get to the combine and they weigh in. And at running back, where running back weight does have a little bit of correlation to fantasy success in the NFL. that matters, right? Like if a guy is listed at 220, which is or 215 to 220, which is like an ideal size for an RB1, and then he weighs in at 195 or something, that's a big concern. That's something that you really want to dig into a little bit more. And we're really just talking about like the edges here, right? Like in the middle, the stuff that really is going to be small. It's going to be like a pound here or there, whatever, not a big deal. But there are going to be some players that we look at, we're like, wow, this guy's a lot bigger or smaller than I thought he was.
Yeah. And I mean, we did see that a little bit last year with the quarterbacks, where it was like, oh, okay, thank God Bryce Young weighed in at this. He's acceptable to play in the NFL, or vice versa, where it was like Jahmyr Gibbs weighed in at 199, and it was just everyone was ready to burn down Twitter.
Yeah.
And so it's just, you're right. Like the weight stuff is important, and you do want to make sure that it matches whatever you saw on film or whatever you had going into this when you're creating a prospect profile. But it's also like, we don't want to overstate it either. Like some of it just gets to be ridiculous.
Yeah. And look, this is just a standardized way to get that information. That's the way that you know what I mean? Like, it's very important to, like, I'm not sitting here saying like I know that Jahmyr Gibbs could have easily drank a ton of water before he stepped on that scale, and maybe he was 195. But regardless, like, we're getting a standardized number that every player entering the NFL is going through the same process, the same type of scales, the same measurement sort of way of doing things. And so that side of it is important to me, like to just have the standardization based on what I just said earlier, where you get a dude like Dylan Laube out of New Hampshire, where who knows how New Hampshire is measuring their football players. Like, we have no idea, you know?
I would assume a scale, but yeah.
I would hope they're using a scale up in New Hampshire. I've never been up there, but I would assume they have scales in New Hampshire. Yes. Let's talk about this year's running back class. You know, last year we had Bijan Robinson, we had Jahmyr Gibbs, we had these elite first round, front half first round running back prospects. This year, not so much. We don't really seem to have that stud, right? So as of right now, today, things can change. It's only, well, technically it's still February because it's a leap year. But by the time this drops, it will be March. But regardless, who is your RB1 in this class that lacks that true elite star?
Oh, man. I've already been feeling it as I'm doing the running back analysis, where it's we're trying to push these guys up because there's no way all the running backs are that bad, or they're going to get taken that late, and they're not bad. But if I had to pick who my RB1 is right now, it's Jonathan Brooks out of Texas. In my opinion, from what I've watched, he's the most talented and well-rounded 3-down back in this class. Like, there's not a lot of guys that have the full 3-down set, air quotes, because I mean, that's just not really a thing that much anymore in the NFL anyways. But out of the guys who do have that skill set, I think he's the most talented. He's just really silky smooth when he's running. It looks effortless. And maybe that's also kind of like a trick on my brain too, is that it just looks so simple for him while he's out there. He doesn't take any false steps. There's no wasted effort. He's a really decisive runner, and he sees a lot of these running lanes before they open. And something I like to do with running backs is, you have the all-22. I like watching from the camera angle of the backfield with the running backs every time I can. And I like to play this game where I'll just slow down the film almost to like a pause where it's at a fraction of the speed. And I'll try to identify the running lane of where it's supposed to be on that play and where the offensive line is opening something up, and see, is the running back going to make the right decision? Obviously, it's going a lot faster for them. It's going incredibly fast. I'm at a full pause, so it's not like I have some incredible vision. And he's one of those guys that was like consistently finding the correct running lane, or he was finding something that I didn't even see when the video was paused or going really slow. And to me, like, that was always cool, is to see a guy who kind of has the vision and patience, but doesn't have to totally stop what he's doing. And that's what kind of kills a lot of these running backs when they try to be the patient guy. Everyone thinks they can be a Le'Veon Bell, and they'll almost stop their feet in the backfield. He doesn't really do that. So I like that he's got this full complement of the speed, vision, patience. He can see the cutbacks really well. And he breaks tackles surprisingly well for his size, and like just top 5 in missed tackles force, top 6 in yards after contact per attempt. So like there's all these things. He's being used well in the screen game, and it's not like little dump offs. He's actually getting downfield, which shows that he can run routes, and he's got soft hands. Like, I can keep going on and on, but basically it's just Jonathan Brooks is a good player. And I think the only thing that has us right now looking at him in a negative light is the medical stuff.
Right.
And I know that there's all the reports going out now that, if I'm not mistaken, that Jonathan Brooks doctor who did the surgery is the team doctor for the Dallas Cowboys. So he's getting linked to that team, that, everything's going to be fine. The report is that he should be cleared for training camp. I comped him to Aaron Jones when I was watching him, and it felt very similar. They've got similar sizes. I'd be really disappointed if he weighed in lighter, because he's kind of close to that 205, 207 range. If he ends up weighing in a little bit lighter, I don't think he has that same kind of speed and dynamic ability that Jahmyr Gibbs has. So I would be a little bit disappointed if he weighed in lighter.
Yeah, I think that if he didn't have that ACL that occurred last year, he would probably be the consensus RB1 in this class. That's my general take. The problem that I then have from a fantasy perspective is not so much anything you just said, because even in my model, what I've seen, I also agree with you that he's at least up there as the most talented back in this class. The one worry that I have is just from a value perspective in fantasy and the way that he would appreciate in value in year one. It's not a Jameson Williams situation identically at all, because Williams obviously, it was a later injury. His evidently seemed worse than what's going on here. And then obviously they really slow played it with Williams during his rookie season. And then, I don't know if Williams it's just different when you're translating a running back versus wide receiver, right? But I do think that just from like a game theory perspective, something for fantasy managers to at least think about is right now, everything's butterflies and rainbows with Jonathan Brooks. Going to be good by training camp, all that good stuff. You have to ask yourself, what if he's not? And if he's not, what does that mean? It means maybe a late season breakout. Maybe it won't happen during his rookie season, or maybe he'll be more in a tandem, his rookie year, as opposed to being able to carve out the whole backfield. So I'm not disagreeing with you whatsoever. It's just this additive piece that I think people have to think about as they're ranking these guys and as they're going to be drafting them in rookie drafts, because it is a piece to what's going on with him is this injury, and I do think though that the injury is basically putting him in a bucket with some of the other guys, as opposed to if he didn't have the injury, he would just kind of be alone up there.
Yeah, and I mean, you're pointing out something that's really important, right? Like, just because he's the most talented does not mean, or at least in my eyes, does not mean that he will be the most productive guy in year one, right? And so, like, that's kind of the thing. Like, everything you said is 100% true. Like, if he is not able to go at the beginning of training camp and he doesn't, fire off like gangbusters at the beginning, then yeah, it's probably not likely that you see a whole lot of production from him in year one, and it ends up being something that kind of takes a little bit of time, and you don't often see that trajectory for running backs. Like, sometimes you get lucky and it does happen. But yeah, I think that it's a cop out. It's such a cop out. Everyone is saying it, but it's kind of true. The landing spot is going to be so important for these running backs. And it's like, if someone ends up on the Chargers and we know Jim Harbaugh wants to run the ball a ton, or they end up on the Cowboys with no Tony Pollard or whatever it is, like, yeah, it's going to be big for these guys. So the landing spot's going to matter even for the top guy, at least in, from what I have right now in my grade, Jonathan Brooks. Yeah,
look, landing spot didn't matter for Bijan Robinson and even Jahmyr Gibbs to some degree. Jahmyr Gibbs, the bigger deal was the fact that he went 12th overall, as opposed to the fact that he went to the Lions, right? But yeah, landing spot was going to allow those guys to still be good dynasty assets, to be able to accumulate value. It's different when you're talking about lower tiered, like a lot of these guys in this class have like RB2 type ceilings in the NFL in terms of their fantasy outlook, right? And so you want to have that additional boost, like you said, if they go to a Chargers or something like that, where they could walk in and then just be a bell cow. That's important, especially for their year one value, to see that appreciate. One player that a lot of people in the analytics world at the running back position is Braylon Allen. On one hand with him, I'm kind of in the middle at this point. I want to see how the combine goes this weekend with him a little bit, because on one hand, his age-adjusted production is literally like unmatched. Like, it's crazy, because he left high school a year early and he was playing at Wisconsin as a 17-year-old, and then he broke out as he was a freshman. I mean, he was getting production as a freshman at Wisconsin, which is crazy. And physically, big dude. I mean, like we're talking like AJ Dillon type size, maybe not quite as big, but almost that big. So that's the good part, I guess you could say, is the age adjusted stuff. I don't know if the size part is necessarily good or bad, but on the other hand, you have this size with Braylon Allen, but his forced missed tackles per rush was below average compared to other running backs in this class. And you have to wonder what's going on there. So what you saw with Braylon Allen, did you see that the fact that he's this bigger bodied back that doesn't necessarily know how to use his size? And then do you like him or not like him?
So Braylon Allen, this is one of those things where it's actually the stuff that I learned watching high school players go to college. This actually translates pretty well for Braylon Allen because so much of his production came as a freshman, where like he was already just bigger than all the dudes he played against in high school football. He came into college already at what we would be considering NFL size. It's almost kind of like the kid that you play basketball with that gets the growth spurt and then the coach puts him at center. And then everyone else kind of like, he just stops growing and everyone grows past him. And like that kid never learned how to do anything else. And so like, he just kind of, the skills never develop. I'm not trying to say like that's what happened with Braylon Allen, but it kind of feels like that, where he just showed up and he was bigger than everyone. He could do all the things that were necessary as a running back. And I don't want to diminish what he did as a freshman because it's still incredibly impressive. Right. But, if I'm going to be a little crass when I'm talking about his film, like I was just bored. I was actually bored. And there is somewhat of an emotional aspect that goes into watching a player. If a player excites you immediately, you're like, oh, I love this dude. And that's why, guys develop these draft crushes. I was really bored watching his film. Even when I come across a player like this, I say, okay, let me throw on the highlights. If the best plays can get me excited, then cool. Maybe I'm back in. I throw on the highlights and it's just, a lot of them are these completely untouched runs against, schools like Buffalo and Georgia Southern, where he's just, his linemen are doing a great job blocking for him. All he has to do is just run. When I set up my watch list for all these prospects, I put him first because there was so much hype around him. He had the early production, great size. And it's Wisconsin. Like they pretty much always have a good running back. There was just no creativity when he's running. It's just it's very north and south. And that's usually fine if you're going to be, one of these guys that can pick up steam, get downhill like Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry doesn't juke a lot of guys. He doesn't move a whole lot laterally. Braylon Allen tries to run that way, but then he never actually runs people over. He doesn't move laterally very well. By the time I finished, I was looking at my notes. The last road I note was, oh my God, just run somebody over already. Like I wanted to see it, and it just didn't happen. It almost reminds me of, and I hate to use this as a derogatory thing, but it kind of reminds me of like the Alabama running back Bo Scarborough from 2018, who was just like a big guy, but you didn't really see all that from him. And so I was disappointed watching Braylon Allen. I would be really surprised if he ends up being one of the top 2 or 3 running backs drafted. But like you said, we do kind of have to live in that gray area. And if he ends up on one of those teams that takes him early and wants to use him around the goal line, wants to give him, 16, 18, 20 touches a game, the value changes a little bit. But from what I evaluated on film and where I think he probably ends up getting drafted, it doesn't look great.
Yeah, I mean, that's another reason. Everything you just said is a big reason why I'm curious as to how like he does this weekend at the combine, right? I mean, if we see him test really, really well, I think he's testing. I haven't seen the full list of people who aren't testing, so I could be completely wrong. But let's say that he runs a 4.5 40, which is crazy at his size. Then all of a sudden you're like, okay, well at least he has a straight line speed that we're worried about his lateral work. But if the straight line speed is there, then we at least can say, okay, maybe there's a little bit more to this. But if he's, more in that like 4.6 range, and then you don't see it on film and his force missed tackles per rush is pretty poor, then it's kind of painting a negative picture despite the fact that, he has this age-adjusted profile that is kind of bonkers, right? It's pretty crazy the fact that he left. Not only that, it's crazy that he left high school and was as big as he was, let alone at 17 years old. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, for him, I want to see not so much the 40, which I mean, yeah, that's good and all to see that he has the long speed. I want to see that he's got that initial burst in his 10-yard split. And I kind of want to see if he does any of those agility drills with the 3-cone and shuttle and stuff like that. I want to see where he ends up there because I've got a feeling they're probably not going to be good, but he is one of those guys that when he does pick up steam, he can do well in a straight line. So I'm really interested in a lot of the more like short yardage stuff because that's probably going to end up being his role in the NFL. So if he's not an explosive dude and he's not making guys miss in the backfield, I get really worried about that.
Yeah. As of today, NFLmockdraftdatabase.com, which is a great resource for people if you're trying to look at sort of projected draft capital. I use that as my projected draft capital in the pre-draft model that gets released with the prospect guide. The top 5 running backs over there are Trey Benson, Blake Corum, Jonathan Brooks, Braylon Allen, and then Bucky Irving. Outside of those running backs, who are a couple of running backs, few running backs, however many you want to talk about, who you seem to sort of be into thus far in the process?
All right, I got a 3-pack for you. I will do my best to be as succinct as possible, because if not, I'll ramble forever. The first guy, Marshawn Lloyd, who is probably in one of my upper tiers for running backs. He didn't do much as a freshman, stood out as a sophomore, transferred from South Carolina to USC. Exactly when Caleb Williams transferred from Oklahoma to USC. What a coincidence. But he was good, man. He was good. When I turn on the film, creative runner, a guy that could improvise, or, you know, like make running lanes when the blocking isn't there. That's a big reason that I liked Kenneth Walker so much, is he can take what's there and what's blocked for him, but he can also just find running lanes when they're not available. And so for Marshawn Lloyd, the feet are really good. He's able to change direction, move laterally really easily, what that does is, when you can do that, it manipulates these linebackers into almost kind of like sinking into wherever you want them to go. And then it allows the linemen to reach their blocks easier. And then a guy like Lloyd or Walker, whomever, they can sort of bounce outside or get to a new running lane. And that's what turns into these explosive plays. So guys that can manipulate linebackers and then have the speed to then get through the new running lane, that's awesome. And so he led the NCAA in percentage of runs to go for 15 or more yards. And he does strike me a lot to be very similar to Kenneth Walker. He also does the same thing that Walker did, though. He bounces a lot of runs outside, even when they don't need to go outside. And so that might be something he has to get better at the next level. I'd say he's another one of these guys. It's a complete back. He can catch the ball. He's got the size to be a goal line back. He's somewhere around like 215 in terms of size. So he's got that mold where if there's a running back needy team that drafts him with some high capital, he can be a day one starter or very valuable in a committee, almost kind of like, and I hate to do this because it's so fresh, but like a Zach Charbonnet, where he's got the size to be a goal line guy, but he's also got the hands where he can be the passing guy. The other two guys here, so Jalen Wright out of Tennessee, my first notes when I was watching this film was, holy bleep, he's fast.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're going to see at the combine. Probably close to like a 4.3. He should crush the jumps as well. He was on Bruce Feldman's freak list where he's cited running 23.5 miles per hour in practice, which is like, that's crazy. That's right up there with all the fastest guys in the NFL. So I think that what a lot of people are going to look at is, okay, we've got the kind of Mickey Mouse, Josh Hoople offensive scheme at Tennessee, where, I mean, they dogged a lot of the receivers for that last year, and kind of rightfully so. But this modified vertical spread offense that they run, it makes it so that defenses really have to spread out. There's not a lot of defenders in the box. So Jalen Wright's going up against like 6 dudes in the box. And so there's not a whole lot of pressure on him, which this allows to create for big runs. But we're starting to see a little bit more of that in the NFL. I think that smart, progressive offenses and smart coaches are finding ways to incorporate that kind of offense to the NFL. Like they're not being stubborn with it. With Wright, the thing is that he never really had the big workload. You never really saw him take over. That's just kind of a Josh Heupel thing where he never really had a workhorse running back. But what I loved with him on film, doesn't really go down on first contact. He's a good pass catcher who got more involved in his final year in school. And I mean, he's one of those guys. He's a one-cut slasher, kind of high-cut body. He reminds me a lot of Raheem Mostert. And we kind of saw the model for that. A guy who's super fast, one-cut, and part of a committee can still be valuable in the NFL and for fantasy. So yeah, like I'm cool with that. We're not seeing bell cows like we used to. We saw like 4 running backs last year that were actually getting 20 touches a game. That's such a change from 2019 where it was 10 guys. It's the NFL running game is just changing so much. And so I think that teams can utilize a guy like Jalen Wright.
Yeah. And, real quick with Jalen Wright too, like just as a random aside, the fact that Mike Shanahan, the Shanahan system is so prevalent.
All the Shanahans.
Across the NFL. Like a Jalen Wright going to Houston should very, very much bump up his draft capital, his ADP from a rookie draft standpoint. It's not unlike, it's to a lesser degree, but it's not unlike a Devon Achane going to Miami last year, right? Where you have that zone guy, that guy who can play in the zone scheme.
I almost said his name.
Right. It was just very, very fast, and sometimes that's all you need in some of these offenses. And so Jalen Wright is someone who, more so in my opinion than some of these other running backs, could be landing spot dependent, but I'm saying that from the standpoint of ceiling, like just him completely crushing in sort of a tandem. Maybe he's the 1A in a backfield, but if he goes to a spot like that, he could just destroy.
Yeah, I almost said Devon Achane too, and it's just, I didn't want to be too irresponsible there and get people too like excited about these guys.
Sure.
The last guy that I had here on the list, Ray Davis out of Kentucky, who, okay, this was such an interesting, fascinating story and profile, and I do think it needs context because every time I would tell someone, I think this kid's good, they'd say, well, he's not a kid. He's basically your age. Like he's getting ready to apply for AARP.
Exactly.
And it's like, I get it. He's an older prospect. He's 24, but I do think his story needs some context. Like, he was one of these guys, and I'm sure the NFL draft and coverage will have a field day with this stuff, but he was in foster care at the age of 8, then in homeless shelters as a teen. And it really affected the way his high school story kind of went. He fell one credit short of being NCAA eligible as a high school senior. So he had to go and do another year at a boarding school, and then finally got to go to college a year later. He did break out as a true freshman in 2019. He was at Temple. He had over 1,000 total yards, 8 touchdowns. He was good. And then 4 games into his sophomore year, he's just like, you know what? This is not working out for me here at Temple. I'm going to transfer. He cut his season short, goes to Vanderbilt. He wins the starting job there, then gets a toe injury. And so now if you're looking at the profile, you're like, well, it's 2 years where he really didn't do anything. So what happens? Then he finally comes back next season as a senior, runs for 1,000 yards, catches 29 passes, 8 touchdowns. He does a good job there at Vanderbilt. He gets the final year, right? Where it's like, now he goes to even bigger competition. That's the thing I liked about him, is that he kept transferring against better and bigger competition. And he goes to Kentucky, blows up for 1,100 rushing yards, 33 receptions, 21 touchdowns. Like the numbers, the film, all of it looked great. He crushed over at the Senior Bowl. My comp for him is Jaylen Warren after a big lunch. Like that, he's a lot like him. And I think that the big detractor here is going to be people saying he's old.
Yeah.
And it's, and I kind of look at that and I say, okay, well, how often are we really getting a good, 6, 7, 8 years out of running backs in the NFL anyways? It's very few and far between. So if I can get a Jaylen Warren style production from this guy over the next couple of years, and I don't have to spend a really high rookie draft pick on him, I kind of like Ray Davis as one of those late round sleepers.
Yeah, I think that's the key, is the fact that he is not going in the first 3 rounds probably of a super flex rookie draft. We don't know draft capital or anything, but I'd be shocked if he would. And so when it comes to age, because he's basically 2 years older than like Breece Hall and Tajay Spears right now. Ray Davis is. And so like that's something that we at least have to keep in mind, because if you're going to invest in someone like that, then that he's not going to be around that long. He's probably not going to, like, let's be honest, he's probably not going to get more than a rookie contract in the NFL. And so that there's this window, that more than likely from a dynasty perspective, he's not going to really accumulate in value that well. This isn't like I've seen him sort of comp to like a Kyren Williams type, which I think is not totally wrong necessarily, like a small, like a not necessarily amazing athlete who can kind of do it all, a little bit smaller in terms of the of height, especially. And so I get that. The problem is that there's still an ascension happening for a guy like Kyren Williams, hypothetically, because of age and stuff. Whereas it's just not going to, that career arc just isn't going to be there for Ray Davis. But to your point, which is why I don't disagree with you, is you're not getting Davis in the first or second round of your rookie drafts, just like you weren't with Kyren Williams. But that's not really what, Kyren Williams didn't have any age problems. So if you're getting him in the 4th, it's not a big deal.
Yeah, and you know what, too, like, I always think it's really funny when we take these prospects and then we compare them to the absolute outliers. Like Kyren Williams' story for the NFL is not something we typically see.
Yeah,
a guy who, like, I didn't really like him on film, but then he did not do well at the combine. He didn't really do anything as a rookie. And then he was not the starter to start the second season. It happened to be where there was more drama with Cam Akers, and then Cam Akers was gone, and he happened to be on this really good team that was willing to give him a ton of carries.
Right.
I don't think in any of the other 31 NFL teams, Kyren Williams was getting a ton of carries like that. It just happened to work out.
Right. 100%. Yeah, look, Kyren Williams was great last year, but I also think that we have to give credit to a player like Williams who clearly got better, right? Like that's the thing that, like, when we're prospecting these players, we can't just assume that they're the same player year 3 in the NFL as they were entering the NFL, and right. I think Williams, when you watch him last year versus what you saw at Notre Dame versus what you saw year 1 in the limited action that we saw, different guy, and credit to him for doing what he did, right?
Even within the season, he got better from his first start all the way towards the end of the season. It was like, okay, this is a guy that can actually make people miss it and make the smart decisions to find running lanes.
Right, exactly. So I understand that people want to look at higher end comps a lot of times because it allows you to sort of see ceiling and understand ceiling a little bit better. But I do think that when it comes to comps and the way that some people view them, it does the listener and the consumer a disservice because they then just think that's what this player will be. Like I was on the Yahoo show with Matt Harmon earlier this week, and we were talking about some comps and stuff like that. One of the comps that popped up for Brian Thomas for me was Torrey Smith. And when you say Torrey Smith, people are like, oh man, like that sucks. Like Brian Thomas is a first round pick. Torrey Smith wasn't a bad wide receiver at all in the NFL. Like if you were to get peak Torrey Smith out of Brian Thomas, that's not even a bad use of first round capital, Right. And so I think that like our minds have to switch a little bit with the way that we view comps in general. We'll get to that in one player in particular in just a second. Let's shift our focus to wide receiver though. Talked a lot about running backs. This wide receiver class better than the running back class, hands down, at least in my opinion. You have sort of this big two at least with Marvin Harrison and Malik Neighbors, but then some people will throw Rome Odunze in there too as sort of a big three. I've seen that more so with draft scouts, the more traditional draft scouts than the fantasy folks, but a lot of people love Rome Odunze. I like Rome Odunze too. I just don't think that he's necessarily in the same tier as those other guys. Where are you at with Odunze? Do you think that he is as special, as good as a Malik Neighbors or Marvin Harrison?
I think there's a clear delineation between those top two guys and then Rome Odunze, but I still like him a lot. I like Rome a lot. I think if you go back and like try to maybe compare him to last season's class, like I'd put him ahead of JSN. Yeah. And so it's like one of my favorite things that I heard throughout this process is that like Rome Odunze isn't bad. Like he's not your traditional third wide receiver in a draft class. He's just really unlucky that he's got these two great prospects ahead of him. And they truly are. But I think Rome's going to be a top 12 pick. I think it's, it's so hard when I try to do this. It's so hard to contextualize observations on film to like just to say it into an audio podcast. So like I'll try to like reference the data that supports the observations. With Rome Odunze, I love his hands. Receivers with bad hands, it pisses me off. Like that's part of your job description, and you like receiver, and you can't do it. So I love that he has one of the lowest drop rates while having one of the higher contested catch rates and yards per route run. So it's just like, he's doing all this while having to make more challenging catches downfield. And that offense, I know we like to talk about how the offense was great and it put up so many points. A lot of that is on him. A lot of that is on Rome Odunze. I went and one of the first players I watched for this whole class was Michael Penix because he seems to be someone that's very vexing. And I wasn't into Michael Penix. A lot of what he's doing is just kind of like chucking it up off his back foot, and Rome Odunze and the other receivers on this team sort of saving him with winning jump balls and having to adjust. And he did a lot of like what I saw, and I hate to do this to myself, a lot of what I saw from Tua Tagovailoa this year, where a ball gets underthrown, Tyreek has to adjust, come back to it, or go in a different direction. Rome Odunze is really good at that. And it's not just like the deep balls where he's adjusting. It's even on just really short stuff where it'll be a fade. And he knows how to kind of manipulate the DB and slow down his feet, take smaller steps so that at the last second he can sort of like jump out and go after the ball. It really does look like a center fielder who's just able to track the ball really well. One of the things that I hear about is like he can't separate. He separates just fine. This reminds me a lot of the same stuff that we talked about with Drake London back when he was coming out. And so I see like a few different, comps for him for Odunze. He's a little bit bigger, but I'd say he's really similar to Devontae Adams. And before anyone freaks out, like I'm not saying he's going to be consistently top 5 wide receiver in the NFL every single season, but he does a lot of the same things that Devontae does while also not being the most athletically gifted.
Yes.
So he has to run his routes in a very smart manner. And so like, that's the kind of thing that I see that I'm like, okay, he's not quite as dynamic and explosive as Malik Neighbors. And, he doesn't have the same, just special God-given ability that Marvin Harrison Jr. has, but Rome Odunze is still a really, really good player.
Yeah, what's funny is you brought up Drake London. That's one of the 3 comps that my model spit out for Rome Odunze. Another one was his bad one. I like to, it's nice whenever there's like, you could see the range of outcomes here. His bad one was Michael Floyd. Okay, let's just throw that out there.
Okay.
And let folks know that there are not perfect comps for him like there are for Marvin Harrison Jr. and Malik Neighbors. The top one, though, is DeAndre Hopkins for Rome Odunze.
Yeah, and I see that.
And
I
again,
see that a lot.
Goes back to it's not like he's this like overly athletic separator, but he knows how to manipulate his body in ways to create that separation.
Yeah. He's not quite as aggressive as DeAndre Hopkins, but he's just a smart route runner.
Yep. Ladd McConkey. Let's talk about him. He's a player I brought up on the episode earlier this week because his breakout score was lacking. He ended up running the 5th most routes at Georgia last year, which I still can't totally wrap my head around. I mean, I know that there's some injury concerns like throughout the season or whatever, like not 100%, like how football players are just banged up throughout the year. There's game script related stuff. There's all that kind of stuff. But you still have to ask the question, why the heck is that going on, right? And then the thing is, though, on a per route run basis, he looks amazing. There has never been in my database a bigger discrepancy between yards per team pass attempt and yards per route run than what I see with Ladd McConkey. And I will say the same exact thing happened last year with some guy named Puka Nacua. And so I'm curious what you saw. And I'm not saying that they're the same kind of player. I'm just saying, statistically and from a numbers perspective, we can still sort of latch onto that yards per route run number and get a little bit excited. What are you seeing with McConkey on film?
By the way, don't backpedal. You said Ladd McConkey is Puka Nacua. Deal with it. I mean, apparently he's also, let's just go through all of my comps for him. Cooper Kupp, Julian Edelman, Adam Thielen, Hunter Renfrow, Wes Welker, Danny Amendola. Yeah, all those guys.
Yes.
Okay. So we talked about Ladd McConkey for this show, and just when I started to do my review on him, I think a lot of people assume he's probably only going to play slot at the next level. He actually did play a little bit out wide the year before. It was just this past year he kind of moved back to slot, and I do think that's probably where he makes his home at the next level. Georgia not using him a ton was infuriating. Some of it is injury, like you said. Some of it is like personnel grouping. It really seemed like they wanted to get the ball to Brock Bowers as much as they could, and rightfully so. So with McConkey, super talented route runner. I tend to be a sucker for guys like this. He changes speed really well in his routes, so he's able to get open. He does kind of an underrated thing. He can decelerate, and that's really big for receivers. Like, how seamlessly can you go from full speed to maybe 3/4 speed, change direction, get the DB to kind of overrun the route, and then you have a nice cushion zone. He can do that really well. He restacks against defensive backs. And so like that's some like scouting jargon there for the audience. It's basically when a receiver can get the defensive back out of position. So now he's trailing the receiver. And once that defensive back is behind him, he no longer has an easy angle to the ball or to the end of the route. So he's kind of playing that 50-50 game. So it means that the receiver will kind of run back into the defensive back and eat up all that space that was allowing for a good angle from that defensive back. And, he does all that stuff really well. All the things that you want out of a wide receiver to run routes. What I started to get a little down on is he's not very physical. And if you have a guy who's going to work the slot like that, you're almost hoping that he's going to have to go untouched every single time. Now, I get it. The NFL is running a lot more zone, but when there is a guy that latches onto him, because McConkey doesn't have like blazing 4.4 or 4.3 speed, when there is a DB that kind of latches onto him, he will get out-muscled. He will struggle against press coverage. He won't see it as much nowadays in the NFL, but he struggles with it. So if there was a weakness to have, I think that's fine, because a player like him, he can get in the weight room and improve his play strength. That's where the little bit of a concern was for me. So as I did the evaluation, he's good. He'll probably be a day 2 pick, probably in round 2. From what I understand, the NFL is a bit higher on him than most people. He kind of reminds me of Van Jefferson, who is like the comp that I'm not hearing for him. A guy just a little undersized, good route runner, but not great play strength. If I actually had to pick, there's a guy that I like better, who's the other guy who's getting like kind of categorized as a slot receiver, and it's Ricky Pearsall, who
yeah. Let's talk about Pearsall, baby, because I am on board. Yeah.
Oh, so like I watched McConkey and I was like, all right, let's go get the other Cooper Cup comp in the class and let's see what he can do. And man, like it's one of those things that as soon as you throw on film or maybe for you, it's like just looking at the numbers and you're like, oof, this looks good. That's how I felt. And he's a good zone beater. He can win in man coverage too. He's a bit stronger than McConkey, but he's not like some beast there. He does everything pretty much the same as McConkey, but he's got better play strength, a better deep ball tracker. And I like, there's kind of a thing that's not being talked about. I like that he's had success in different systems. Yeah. And with 3 different quarterbacks, you go from Jaden Daniels to Anthony Richardson to now the kid at Florida now, Mertz. And I love that he's had 5 rushing touchdowns. That's something that you can see. The team is willing to use him in different ways. Players who do more get on the field more. We saw that with Jaden Reed, a guy that both of us liked last year. And I see some of those same things where it's like, okay, you can use him on some screens, some jet sweeps, some things like that. And I'm doing my best to be more confident in these. And like, even if Pearsall doesn't get the draft capital I like, I'm still haunted by the fact that I was like, okay, I'll keep Quentin Johnston ahead of Jaden Reed in my rankings, even though I like Reed better because I couldn't say no to a first round wide receiver. So Pearsall's one of those guys that he's becoming a favorite of mine.
Dude, I love that you just brought up Jaden Reed. That is my top comp for Pearsall.
Oh, let's go.
And you look at what they did analytically, and you can see it too. They're both very physical players, right? Like and especially like when you put size into context too, because they're not like 210, right? They're not like these. Right. I think Jaden Reed's a little bit more compact. We'll see what the actual measurements look like, but Jaden Reed's kind of more of that, like, I don't want to say bowling ball type because he's not like Jalen Warren, but he's more compact size wise.
He's stockier.
Right, than Pearsall is. But when you look at the totality of their profiles, both of them entering the NFL a little bit older, right? Pearsall played 5 years in college. Jaden Reed was a little bit older as well, over 23 with both of them. But like you said, when you get these players who were used in so many different ways in their offenses, like in line, out wide, getting these end arounds and getting work on the ground. They got some work on special teams as well. When you're getting these players used in all these different ways and in multiple systems, as you said with Pearsall, that's a sign of talent. Like purely, that's just a sign of talent. And so right now, Pearsall, it doesn't look as good as McConkey in the prospect model because of projected draft capital, but he does not look that bad. And when you really dig into these numbers and dig into the profile and then see what folks are watching and seeing, Pearsall is someone that everyone should be paying attention to right now, because I wouldn't be shocked, dude, if by the time April rolls around and they're calling names on day 2 that he's a second round pick. Like I wouldn't be surprised if that ends up happening, which is sort of what we saw with Jaden Reed, where Reed last year, one of the main reasons that I was on Jaden Reed is because my prospect model saw one of his top comps as Stephon Diggs. And so I'm like, okay, this is strange. I mean, this guy isn't really supposed to be that amazing at this point, right? It's February at the time. So I messaged Matt Harmon. Harmon watches him and he's like, this guy's unbelievable. And so just all of that, like it's sort of this like accumulation of different people coming to me and saying, yeah, this guy's good. And then me feeling more confident in that player being good. And then all of a sudden, what happens on draft day? He goes day 2. He goes on round 2 to Green Bay. I think a very similar thing is going on with Pearsall. I said that on Twitter earlier this week. I didn't mean that from the standpoint of just hype. I meant it also from play style and the way these guys actually play on a football field. I think there's a lot of similarities there.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that we're going to see that draft stock continue to go up, especially I think he's going to run faster than people assume at the combine too. If he goes out there and runs a 4.4, that draft stock's just going to keep going up.
Yeah, 100%. All right, one more wide receiver I want to talk about. I think that he is going to be pretty controversial once more and more people either see him / look at his analytical profile just within the fantasy space. That's Malachi Corley. You've scouted him. I'd love to hear your take. People are comparing him to Deebo Samuel. My model does see the Deebo comp. That's actually his number 2 comp, but his number 1 comp, who I think he looks a lot more like, is Amari Rodgers, who coming out also people were saying is a Deebo Samuel type. So I just think there's a wide range of outcomes here. What do you see with Corley?
I get the Amari Rodgers thing. I actually do. I feel like we've got Debo fatigue. Like
Dude.
the Debo comps are like Marvel movies at this point. It's just like, okay, cool.
I want to echo something that Harmon said on the podcast I did with him earlier this week that is so important. Yes, these players might be physically built and gifted like a Debo Samuel, but Debo Samuel is not the Debo Samuel that we know and love in terms of what he does in the football field outside of San Francisco, right? He's not going to get that kind of opportunity to do what he's doing, not in that system. Not to say that he wouldn't get some touches out of the backfield, or he wouldn't be doing the things that he's doing if he wasn't playing in San Francisco. So I do think, like, from that perspective, we got to like cool our jets a little bit on the Debo Samuel stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, with Corley specifically, I think that he looked really good at the Senior Bowl. He went out there and he kind of proved to people that he can run routes, because like that's not something you see a lot on film. A lot of what he's having to do is take screens. I probably should have fact checked this, but I think he had like the most, or like top 3 in college football in screen receptions.
Yes.
Like,
he was very high in both screen percentage of targets that were screens and percentage of targets that came behind the line of scrimmage. Yeah.
Yeah. And that stuff shows obviously on film. I get the Amari Rodgers thing, because, you know, Corley's kind of like in a running back body, like 5'11", 215, not typically what you see for these receivers. The thing that's a little bit different here is he's really good at breaking tackles. I know he's got this nickname as the Yak King or Yak God or one of the Yaks, but like he's a thick, strong guy, good at breaking tackles. I didn't like the way he was used, but that also is kind of like, I've seen FIU play Western Kentucky plenty of times, and that's just kind of what teams in those conferences do, is like, let's just get the ball to our best player the easiest way possible and let him cook. And I know we're seeing more NFL teams do that. And I'm trying to open my eyes a bit more to, okay, just because we haven't seen a player like Malachi Corley do a lot of downfield stuff doesn't mean he can't do it. So the Senior Bowl made me feel a little bit better about him. Last year, the guy who I was like, he doesn't seem like he can do much is Rashee Rice.
Yeah.
And I was totally wrong. And like, it's just like, okay, he was the downfield jump ball guy. And then he goes to Kansas City, and that's not who he is at all. He's catching a ton of screens and quick hitters, and led the NFL in yards after catch. So it's just, sometimes these guys just do things that are different. And funny enough, now the Chiefs are rumored to be super high on Malachi Corley. Maybe they want him to do that role. But I think that Malachi Corley, let's not get over our skis on him. I like him. He's a good player. I think he's going to end up being something kind of like a Wan'Dale Robinson, like what he was for the Giants. But he's got to end up in one of those situations where you have a quarterback that likes to hit the slot, because Corley's probably not going to line up out wide. He was exclusively in the slot. Same thing for another guy that I like that's almost like a twin, and it's Malik Washington out of Virginia. Both of these guys are essentially the same player that weren't asked to do a whole lot on routes, but they're playmakers. And some NFL team is going to go and draft these guys probably on day 2, because I feel like there's just going to be a ton of wide receivers getting drafted earlier. The difference with Corley is that he's just a little bit thicker and he can break tackles. Washington's about 20 pounds lighter, 2 inches shorter. So it's a little bit of a different player. Those are the guys that I think you kind of just wait. I'm okay missing on them. I'm okay not drafting them in my rookie drafts, but if they fall to me in round 3 of my Superflex rookie drafts or whatever, I'm excited to grab them, because I think they can have kind of that Wan'Dale Robinson type production in the right scenario.
Yeah, I love the Malik Washington call out. He's someone, I mean, he was playing with awful quarterback play at Northwestern and such, and then he went to Virginia and just absolutely dominated last year. Just completely crushed last year. But I also think that's the kind, like the Corley archetype might be one that just is better in real football than fantasy football. Right. Yeah. Where it's someone who's going to be able to sort of take on an identity for an offense and help them out that way and be that kind of player. I do think, though, that, and I've seen other folks, or I at least have talked to a couple other people who had sort of that Rashee Rice comp for him. Like that could be what he would turn into. You just got to hope that he falls into a team like Kansas City where Patrick Mahomes is throwing him the ball, right? Like that was so key with a guy like Rice, where like, we still don't fully know how good Rashee Rice will be, because he wasn't asked to do the same things that, you know, a first round wide receiver, let's say, or, you know, like what Marvin Harrison will be asked to do in year 1. And so, you know, I do think that Corley could go that route. It's just a matter of, will it be the Chiefs? You know, will it be a team that's that strong and that good? Or will it be, as you said, the Giants, where Wan'Dale Robinson's at, where it's a little bit more difficult to really let that, be out there and be exposed?
Yeah, I see these guys, and another name I didn't mention is like they kind of give me then the vibes of like a Curtis Samuel, where a team might start to use him a bit more, and then he'll have a few of those blow up games. But I don't know that these are going to be the guys you're relying on week in and week out in fantasy. So they're going to end up being one of those depth pieces you have on your team.
Yeah. All right. One last question before I let you go. We didn't talk quarterbacks at all, but I know that you've watched quarterbacks. Is there a quarterback in this class, just in general, who you think could legitimately break fantasy football?
I mean, it's if I don't come up with this answer, then I just really I shouldn't be doing this. I feel like it's got to be Jaden Daniels. Like that's got to be the easiest answer out of all these guys, just simply because of what he can do with the rushing. And I think that's such a big factor as to why he's probably going to go number 2. I think he's going to go number 2 to the Commanders, just because. One, I think it's so hard to pass up on athleticism like that. Being able to match him up with Cliff Kingsbury there, who's got experience with a capable running quarterback like Kyler Murray. But you talk about like breaking fantasy football, guys, just the quarterbacks that can run have become so incredibly valuable. If you're still not seeing it, just you got to open your eyes. Looking at Anthony Richardson last year, he was a quarterback 3 in points per game before getting hurt.
Yep.
And he wasn't doing anything all that spectacular with his arm, but it was all with the legs. And I know everyone's going to miss me with the whole like Russian quarterbacks get hurt, because Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, they were perfectly fine. We saw a bunch of pocket quarterbacks get hurt throughout the season. So like just go away with that. Anthony Richardson was already an athletic freak at like 245 pounds. So it was a lot of these injuries end up being freak accidents anyways. But Jaden Daniels, if he stays healthy, and even if he's just on the game on the field for half the season, for those games he's out there for you, he's going to be incredibly valuable. And this is a guy that, given how the level of quarterback play we had last year and how many good quarterbacks there are now to draft in fantasy, Jaden Daniels might actually still come at a discount, because you're going to have a lot of the I hate to use the term casual, but like the people who just, play fantasy football in like one league every so often, they're going to say, oh yeah, I remember that rookie last year who was running a bunch, Anthony Richardson, he got hurt. And so they'll stay away from him, and you can get Jaden Daniels at a discount. I will say though, my last thing on Jaden Daniels, I absolutely love all of the non-football player comps he keeps getting, like Johnny Knoxville and Wile E. Coyote, because that is exactly what he does. Like he's just so reckless. He's incredibly talented, but he's super reckless. I hope whatever team he goes to can kind of have him reel it in a little bit.
Yeah, that's hilarious. That's so good. Alfredo, man, it was so good to chop it up with you, man. Let everyone know where they can find you.
Yeah, you can find me on all social media platforms at The Pretend GM, and then all my work is over at Footballguys. I host the Footballguys Fantasy Football Show with Dave Kluge, and we always have some great guests on. Next week, we'll be reacting to the Scouting Combine. We'll have Heath Cummings coming on from CBS, Fantasy Football Today, and we just got a big list of guests throughout the offseason here, so you can check that out every single week wherever you get your podcasts.
And you can check out my stuff over on lateround.com. Make sure you pre-order that prospect guide. It's $11.99, but not for long. It launches on March 11th. And when that happens, it'll be $14.99. So you're saving yourself a few bucks. Nothing wrong with that. Alfredo, once again, thank you so much. And thank you everyone else for tuning in.